On the morning of January 24th, 1944, in the sky over Simpson Harbor, at the heart of the Japanese fortress of Rabaul, one American pilot found himself alone. He had been separated from his own division during a high cover mission, cut off deep over the most heavily defended patch of ground and water in the entire South Pacific. Below and around him, Japanese fighters were climbing and turning into position to tear apart the American bombers he was supposed to be protecting. He did not run for the safety of his own lines. He turned into them. First, Lieutenant Robert Hansen rolled his Corsair over and dropped into the middle of the orbiting Japanese fighters alone, and in the minutes that followed, he shot down 4 of them, and probably a 5th. The words that later went into his Medal of Honor citation were plain and exact. He had waged a lone and gallant battle, and he had struck with devastating fury. Within a month, the greatest Japanese fortress in the South Pacific would have almost no aircraft left to defend it. Its sky swept nearly empty. Nearly 100,000 Japanese troops would sit inside that fortress, trapped and useless, waiting for an invasion that would never come. The cause was not any single battle. It was an American decision to take the base without ever landing on it. Rabaul was not just another target. It was the anchor of Japan's entire war in the South Pacific. Sitting on the island of New Britain, wrapped around the deep water of Simpson Harbor, it held 5 airfields, a fleet anchorage, and, by the height of the campaign, a garrison of roughly 100,000 men. Every Japanese push toward Guadalcanal and New Guinea had been launched, supplied, or supported from Rabaul. It was the single most heavily defended position the Japanese held anywhere in the theater. From Rabaul, the Japanese had run the war that nearly took Guadalcanal. The night destroyer convoys that fed troops onto that island, the ones the Americans came to call the Tokyo Express, had sailed from its harbor. The aircraft that bombed the Marines on Henderson Field had flown from its airfields. For 2 years it had been the hand that reached down into the southern Solomons, and cutting off that hand was, from the very beginning, the whole purpose of the long and bloody Allied campaign in the region. A direct assault on that fortress would have been a slaughter. The Japanese had spent 2 years digging into the volcanic rock, ringing the harbor with anti-aircraft guns, and packing the base with troops and aircraft. Any American force that tried to storm it by sea and land would have paid a price measured in tens of thousands of lives, a bloodbath to rival anything the Pacific would later see. So the Americans did something that ran against every instinct the enemy expected of them. They decided not to fight that battle at all. Instead, they set out to strangle the fortress, to cut it off, surround it, and empty its sky, and then to walk past it and leave its huge garrison to rot behind the lines. And in January of 1944, the sky over that fortress became the deadliest place a Japanese pilot could be sent. The situation grew so hopeless for the men fed into it that the Japanese themselves gave it a bitter nickname. They called it the sinkhole in the Bismarcks. But the story of how Fortress Rabaul was beaten does not begin in the sky over Simpson Harbor. It begins in a conference room in Quebec in the summer of 1943, with a decision that Japan's mightiest Pacific base would never be stormed at all. To understand the decision, you have to understand what the Japanese had built. When Japan seized Rabaul from a small Australian garrison in early 1942, it was a colonial port town beneath a ring of volcanoes. Within a year, the Japanese had turned it into the beating heart of their southern empire. They carved airfields out of the ground around the harbor until there were 5 of them. They packed the anchorage with warships and cargo vessels. They stationed hundreds of aircraft there and moved men and supplies through it toward every front in the region. The harbor itself was a natural fortress. Simpson Harbor is a flooded volcanic caldera deep and sheltered, ringed by high ground that gave the defenders commanding views and gun positions. The Japanese lined that high ground with anti-aircraft batteries until the sky above the anchorage could fill with bursting steel. Pilots who flew over it came back, describing the air itself as turning black with flak. Rabaul sat in the shadow of active volcanoes, and the ash and the heat and the sudden tropical storms were as much a part of the fortress as the guns were. Cloud built over the harbour almost every day by noon, so that attackers had only a narrow morning window to strike before the target vanished under weather. For nearly 2 years, that combination of distance and defence had kept Rabaul almost untouched. The Allied raids that reached it before 1943 were too small and flew from too far away to matter, and the base shrugged them off without slowing down. When the heavy raids finally began, the Japanese made the attackers pay. A large American air attack in early November of 1943 was later described as the toughest fight the 5th Air Force met in the entire war. But the Allies had also learned to reach the harbour by sea. That same month, American aircraft carriers ran in close and launched their planes against the warships anchored in Simpson Harbour, catching a powerful Japanese cruiser force as it refueled and savaging it in a single afternoon. After that, the great anchorage was no longer safe for the Japanese fleet, and the heavy warships began to stay away. Then, in the autumn of 1943, the Japanese made Rabaul stronger still. After the Allied landings threatened the region, Admiral Minachi Koga stripped the aircraft carriers of the combined fleet and sent their air groups to Rabaul to reinforce it. That decision poured well over 100 irreplaceable carrier aircraft and the veteran pilots who flew them into the base. Rabaul now bristled with something close to 300 aircraft. It was, by any measure, the strongest air fortress Japan possessed south of the home islands. That reinforcement was a gamble, and, in hindsight, a ruinous one. Japan was pouring its finest naval airmen into the defence of a single base, betting that Rabaul could hold and bleed the Allies white in front of it. It was exactly the concentration of strength the Americans had quietly decided not to attack. Every plane and every pilot Japan sent to the fortress was committed to a fight the enemy had already resolved to win a different way, by patience and air power rather than by assault. This was the thing standing in the path of the Allied advance, and for most of 2 years it had been treated as a prize to be captured. The plans drawn up in 1943 assumed that Rabaul would eventually be taken by direct assault, stormed by troops the way fortresses had always been taken. The question was only when, and at what cost. That assumption is where the American decision changed everything. In August of 1943, the Allied leadership gathered at the Quadrant Conference in Quebec. President Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill met with the combined chiefs of staff to settle the shape of the Pacific War. And there, looking at the cost of storming a fortress held by tens of thousands of entrenched men, they made a choice that broke with everything the Japanese were preparing for. They decided that Rabaul would not be captured. It would be bypassed. This is the American decision at the center of the entire story, and it deserves to be stated plainly, because it is the single choice that doomed Fortress Rabaul. The obvious way to defeat a fortress is to attack it. The Japanese had built Rabaul to defeat exactly that kind of attack, and they were confident they could make the Americans bleed for every yard of it. The Americans looked at that confidence and simply refused to give the enemy the battle he had spent 2 years preparing to fight. It was part of a larger idea that would come to define the whole Pacific War, the idea that later became known as island hopping or leapfrogging. Rather than reduce every Japanese stronghold in turn, the Allies would seize only the islands they needed for airfields and anchorages, and would jump past the strongest positions leaving them isolated and irrelevant behind the advance. Rabaul was the largest and most important test of that idea. If the strongest fortress in the theatre could be neutralized without a landing, the concept would work anywhere. It was a genuinely radical thing to attempt. Armies had always taken fortresses by fighting their way through them, and leaving 100,000 armed enemy troops sitting astride the supply lines went against centuries of military instinct. The Americans were betting that a base the enemy could not use was as good as a base destroyed, and that a garrison sealed off from the war could simply be ignored. If they were wrong, they would have a powerful army loose behind their advance. Rabaul would be the proof, one way or the other. The plan that carried the decision out was called Operation Cartwheel. Under General Douglas MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific and Admiral William Halsey in the South Pacific, Allied forces would advance in two great arms, one through New Guinea and one up through the Solomon Islands. The arms would close around Rabaul from two directions. They would seize the islands and airfields surrounding it, one after another, until the fortress was ringed by Allied air power on every side. Then they would neutralize it from the air and leave it to wither on the vine. Not everyone agreed. General MacArthur objected to leaving so powerful a base intact behind his advance, arguing that Rabaul was too dangerous to bypass and too valuable a harbour to waste. But the combined chiefs held firm. No attempt would ever be made to storm the base. The garrison that Japan had assembled to defend Rabaul, a force larger than the one that would later hold Okinawa, would be turned into prisoners of the war, without a single Allied soldier having to fight his way through it. To make the decision work, the Americans needed one thing above all else. They needed to get their aircraft within reach of Rabaul. For most of the war that had been impossible, because the nearest Allied airfields lay hundreds of miles away, too far for fighters to escort bombers over the target and back. The scattered raids that did reach Rabaul in those years were small and easily absorbed. The fortress had simply been beyond the arm of Allied air power. Getting within that reach had taken almost 2 years, and some of the hardest fighting of the war. The long American climb had begun at Guadalcanal in the summer of 1942, and from there it had moved island by island up the Solomon chain, each captured airfield built a little closer to the fortress. Every one of those steps, paid for in blood on jungle islands most people have never heard of, existed in part to bring the bombers and their escorts one hop nearer to Rabaul. Bougainville was the last and biggest of those steps. That changed when the Allies took Bougainville. On the 1st of November, 1943, United States Marines landed at Empress Augusta Bay on Bougainville, the largest island in the Solomons, only a couple of 100 miles from Rabaul. Behind the landing, engineers began carving airfields out of the jungle and the mud, often under fire and in appalling conditions. They built a fighter strip at Torokina, and then 2 bomber fields along the Piva River that the men simply called Piva Uncle and Piva Yoke. By early January of 1944, aircraft could take off from Bougainville, strike Rabaul in the morning before the clouds closed in, and fly home the same day. The building of those airfields was a feat in itself. Navy and Marine construction battalions landed almost on the heels of the infantry and went to work in the mud, under air attack and artillery fire, hacking runways out of swamp and jungle with bulldozers and sweat. A strip that had not existed in November was launching bombers against Rabaul by January. The men who did that work, the engineers and the construction crews, never fired a shot at the enemy, and yet without their unglamorous labour, the whole idea of strangling the fortress from the air would have stayed impossible. Every day they saved brought the bombers over the target sooner. In the end, the reduction of Rabaul was a victory won with bulldozers and steel matting as much as with guns and bombs. For the first time in the war, Rabaul was inside the reach of land-based fighters, and the fighter that would come to define the campaign over it was the Vought F-4U Corsair. The Corsair was one of the finest fighter aircraft of the war, and in the South Pacific it belonged above all to the Marines. It was built around a massive Pratt & Whitney engine that gave it blistering speed and a distinctive bent wing shape, folded down and then back up, so its huge propeller could clear the ground. It was faster than the Japanese Zero. It was far more heavily built. It carried 6 heavy machine guns in its wings, and it could outdive and outclimb the lighter enemy fighter that had ruled the early Pacific sky. The Corsair had not come easily to that role. When it first reached the fleet, its long nose and vicious stall made carrier landings so dangerous that some pilots called it the Ensign Eliminator, and the Navy was happy to hand large numbers of them to the Marines to fly from land instead. From island strips, freed of the need to land on a pitching deck, the Corsair became a killer. Its pilots learned not to try to turn with the nimble Zero, which could outturn almost anything in the sky, but to use their speed and power another way. They would dive from above, strike once, and climb back out of reach to set up again, fighting on their own terms rather than the enemy's. The reversal that the Corsair represented is easy to miss now. In the first year of the war, the Japanese Zero had been the terror of the Pacific sky. Lightly built and astonishingly agile, able to turn inside anything the Allies flew and flown by superbly trained crews. Allied airmen had learned the hard way never to dogfight it on its own terms. The Corsair, and the tactics that came with it, flipped that story. A heavier, faster, better armed machine, flown by men who fought in the vertical instead of in turns, took the Zero's greatest strength and made it useless. Over Rabaul, the fighter that had once owned the sky was now the one being hunted. The men flying over Rabaul belonged to a mixed Allied air command that pulled together Marine and Navy squadrons, Army heavy bombers, and New Zealand fighter pilots in their own machines. It was one of the first truly combined air campaigns of the Pacific War, and it ran on a simple, brutal rhythm. The bombers pounded the airfields and the harbour, the Japanese sent up everything they had to defend the base, and the Allied fighters met them over the target and ground them down. A typical strike was a small armada. Heavy and medium bombers went for the airstrips and the shipping. Dive bombers and torpedo planes worked the anchorage, and above and around all of them wove the fighters, the Corsairs and the Hellcats and the New Zealand pilots, watching the higher air for the interceptors that always came. Coordinating so many aircraft from different services and different nations over a target 200 miles from home, through cloud and flak, was its own kind of achievement, one that would have been almost unthinkable earlier in the war. The arithmetic of that grinding was catastrophic for Japan. In the single month of January 1944, Marine fighters and bomber gunners alone were credited with hundreds of Japanese aircraft destroyed over Rabaul. The base that had held close to 300 aircraft in the autumn was being bled toward 50. And the losses that mattered most could not be counted in machines at all. Japan was feeding its irreplaceable veteran carrier pilots into the sinkhole, and once those men were gone, there was no way to make more of them. The numbers behind the campaign are staggering even now. In January alone, the Marines dropped hundreds of tons of bombs on the fortress, flying mission after mission through the same black flak and the same rising fighters, day after day, week after week. For the men in the cockpits, a strike on Rabaul meant more than 200 miles of open ocean each way, a fight over the target with nowhere to land if an engine failed, and a long, tense flight home over water that had already swallowed friends. The Allies lost pilots too, but their losses were a fraction of what they inflicted, and every week the balance tilted further against the base. Into that campaign came the pilot who would become its sharpest single instrument. First Lieutenant Robert Hansen was not what anyone pictured when they imagined a killer in the sky. He had been born in Lucknow, India, in 1920, the son of American Methodist missionaries. His childhood playmates had been Hindu children. He had gone to a missionary school in the Himalayas, become a champion wrestler in India, and studied at a college in Minnesota before the war swept him into the Marine Corps and into a cockpit. There was a strange foreshadowing in his path to the war. On a bicycle trip through Europe before it all began, he had been in Vienna in 1938, in the very days the Nazis marched in and swallowed Austria, close enough to watch the thing he would later cross the world to fight. He flew his first combat mission in August of 1943, and the kills came slowly at first, 1 and 2 at a time. An ordinary record in a war full of ordinary courage. He arrived in the South Pacific in the middle of 1943 and flew first with the squadron once known as the Black Sheep, before transferring in October to Marine Fighting Squadron 215, the Fighting Corsairs, under Major Robert Owens. Other pilots noticed something about him early. He was quiet on the ground, polite, and remembered the names of the mechanics who patched his aircraft. In the air, he became someone else entirely, a hunter who flew with a cold, aggressive precision that unsettled even the men who admired him. Not everyone liked him. Some of the other pilots found Hansen prickly and quick to take offense, a difficult man to warm to on the ground. What none of them disputed was what he could do in the air. He was a superb marksman and an utterly fearless one, and in a squadron full of aggressive men, he was the most aggressive of all. The same hard edge that made him poor company on the ground made him lethal above it. He was flying among extraordinary company. His squadron, the Fighting Corsairs, would end its short combat life, credited with well over 100 enemy aircraft destroyed, one of the highest totals in marine aviation, and it produced a whole cluster of aces. In a unit like that, to stand out at all, a man had to be remarkable. Robert Hansen did not merely stand out. For a few weeks in early 1944, he outscored every Marine in the Pacific. His war very nearly ended before his legend began. On that same 1st of November, flying cover for the Bougainville landings over Empress Augusta Bay, Hansen threw himself alone at a formation of Japanese torpedo bombers boring in toward the invasion fleet. He forced several of them to drop their loads short and shot one of them down. But in the fight, a rear gunner found his Corsair and set it burning. He put the aircraft down on the open ocean and climbed into a rubber raft. He spent 6 hours alone on the water that afternoon, drifting under the tropical sun, watching the empty horizon and listening for engines. To keep his nerve, he is remembered singing a popular song to himself, of all the things a man might do adrift behind enemy waters. A destroyer, the USS Sigourney, finally found him after a long search and pulled him from the sea. He had every excuse to be a cautious man after that. Instead, when he returned to his squadron, something in him hardened into the most relentless stretch of aerial killing in the Marine Corps. By the middle of January 1944, the campaign over Rabaul was at its height, and Hansen was flying into the sinkhole almost every day. On the 14th of January, escorting bombers over Simpson Harbor, he was again separated from his squadron and again refused to disengage. Alone above a formation of climbing Japanese fighters, he attacked, and in a matter of minutes he shot down 5 Zeros before he was forced to break away, low on fuel and ammunition. It was after fights like that one that the other pilots gave him the name that followed him for the rest of his short life. They called him Butcher Bob. The nickname spread the way such names only spread when they describe something men have watched with their own eyes. Over a span of 17 days, most of them across only 6 days of actual flying, Robert Hansen shot down 20 Japanese aircraft. It was a rate of destruction almost without equal in the war, and it was happening at the exact moment the fortress it was aimed at began to die. By the last days of January, something had shifted over Rabaul. The swarms that had risen to meet every raid were thinner. The veteran pilots who had made the base so dangerous were mostly dead or gone, and the men sent up to replace them did not last long. The fortress still threw up its flak, still fought, still killed, but the sky above Simpson Harbour was starting to empty, and everyone who flew over it could feel the change coming. The decision made in Quebec was coming true, one mission at a time. It took 8 hours to get every name and number in this story right, because the version that circulates online has turned a real man into a cartoon, and the truth about him is stranger and better than the invention. If this is the history you want more of, hit like. One like. Nothing more. Thank you. The lone battle over Simpson Harbour on the 24th of January was the fight that would earn Robert Hansen the Medal of Honor. On a high cover flight, his job was to fly above the bombers and the lower escorts, guarding against fighters that tried to dive on the formation from altitude. It was a lonely place to fly, at the edge of the fight, and it was where he was cut off from his division, deep over the fortress. He found the Japanese fighters orbiting into position to strike at the bombers below him. He had every reason to slip away and rejoin his own formation. He did the opposite. He turned into the enemy alone and fought them where they were strongest, diving through the orbiting fighters, breaking them apart, and firing as the geometry gave him a shot. When it was over, he had brought down 4 zeros and probably a 5th in a single engagement. The citation would call it a lone and gallant battle waged with devastating fury, and it is one of only 2 actions, along with his fight over Bougainville, named in his Medal of Honor. It is worth pausing on what that kind of fight actually demanded. Hansen was alone against a formation of fighters that could outturn him easily, over their own base, hundreds of miles from any friendly ground. To survive at all, he had to fight the way the Corsair fought best, using height and speed, diving on a target, firing in a single slashing pass, and climbing away before the more nimble Zeros could bring their guns to bear. Every pass was a gamble that ended in a kill or in a mistake, and a single mistake over the fortress was almost always fatal. He made pass after pass, and he did not make the mistake. He did not slow down after that. On the 26th of January, he shot down 3 more. On the 30th, flying escort on a torpedo bomber strike against Rabaul, he added 2 zeros and a heavier fighter to his score, part of a mission in which the American force destroyed 21 Japanese planes in all. Those last kills brought his confirmed total to 25, making him the most successful Corsair pilot in the entire war and one of the highest-scoring Marine aces of the Pacific. Those 25 victories put Robert Hansen in the very front rank of American fighter pilots. His streak of 20 in 17 days was spoken of alongside the records of the great aces of both world wars. And had he lived even another month at the rate he was flying, he might have become the highest-scoring American ace of all. Correspondents had already begun to print his name in the papers back home. In the first days of February 1944, he was one of the most famous pilots in the Pacific and one of the deadliest men alive in an airplane. What made the streak even more remarkable was how ordinary the days around it looked. Hansen was not fighting one grand battle. He was flying escort missions, again and again, into the same deadly sky, and the kills came in the middle of routine work, 2 here, 3 there, 5 on a bad day for the enemy. He would land, have his aircraft patched and rearmed, sleep, and go back the next morning. It was that relentlessness, more than any single dogfight, that piled up a score almost no other pilot could match. Hit subscribe right now, because coming up is the last flight of the deadliest Corsair pilot of the war, and the strange, small target that killed him after all the enemy fighters had failed. Do not go anywhere. While Hansen was running up his score, the fortress he was helping to strangle was entering its final crisis. The daily raids never let up. The bombers came in the mornings and hammered the airfields and the anchorage. The fighters swept the sky above them, and the Japanese kept sending up their dwindling stock of aircraft to be shot down. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka, the Japanese commander responsible for the base, watched his air strength drain away in a battle that could not be won and could not be honorably abandoned. The pressure on the fortress was becoming unbearable from every direction at once. In the middle of February, American warships closed in and shelled Rabaul directly, adding naval gunfire to the endless bombing. At almost the same moment, far to the north, the United States Navy fell on the great Japanese anchorage at Truk and wrecked it in a 2-day carrier raid. Truk was the base behind the base, the natural place for Rabaul's defenders to fall back on, and now it too was burning. The Japanese command was running out of ground to stand on. Around the fortress, the ring was closing. Even before Bougainville, in the middle of December of 1943, the 1st Marine Division had landed at Cape Gloucester on the western end of New Britain, seizing another airfield and another grip on the island Rabaul sat upon. Through February, New Zealand troops took the Green Islands to the east, and American forces prepared to seize the Admiralty Islands to the northwest. Every island taken and every airfield built tightened the noose around the base and cut another of its links to the rest of the Japanese Empire. The Allies knocked the other props out from under the fortress as well. Kavieng, the Japanese airfield on the northern tip of New Ireland, was raided again and again to keep it from staging aircraft down to Rabaul. The sea lanes that had once carried reinforcements into Simpson Harbour were swept by Allied aircraft and submarines until almost nothing could reach the base by water. Piece by piece, every way in and every way out was closed, and the fortress was left to stand alone in the middle of a war that had moved on around it. The Admiralties were the final lock. At the end of February 1944, American cavalrymen landed on Los Negros in the Admiralty Islands, with General MacArthur himself coming ashore to watch. Within weeks, the islands and their airfields were in American hands, and by seizing the smaller island groups nearby, the Allies closed the circle completely. Rabaul was now surrounded on every side by Allied air and sea power. The fortress that had launched Japan's war in the region had become an island prison, its huge garrison increasingly cut off from resupply, its sky no longer its own. Then came the 3rd of February 1944, the day before Robert Hansen's 24th birthday. He flew that morning as part of an escort of 8 Corsairs covering 18 torpedo bombers on a strike toward Rabaul. The mission itself went off without disaster, and the formation turned for the long flight home down the coast of New Ireland toward the southern tip of the island at Cape St. George. On that cape stood a lighthouse. It was a small thing against everything else in the campaign, but the Japanese used it as an observation post, and its gun crews had a habit of throwing up flak at the American formations as they passed. It had become a familiar nuisance, a challenging little target that never seemed worth a real effort to destroy. As the formation crossed the cape, Hansen broke away from the group and dove toward it alone. The other pilots called out over the radio, asking what he was doing, telling him to rejoin the formation. He did not answer. He came in low over the water and opened fire on the lighthouse, and the Japanese anti-aircraft crews around it answered at once. their guns reaching up from positions he could not see. What happened next was witnessed by the men flying with him, and his commanding officer, Major Owens, later described it in plain words. Hansen made his strafing run, and then his right wing was seen to strike the water twice. The aircraft pulled up, and the wing caught fire or exploded. For a moment it looked as though he might still bring it down in a controlled landing. Then the Corsair twisted, rolled over, and disappeared into the sea. There was no parachute. There was no raft this time, and no popular song, and no destroyer searching the water. The most lethal Corsair pilot America produced, a man who had fought his way alone through swarms of Japanese fighters again and again, and lived, was killed by the guns of a lighthouse on a routine flight home, one day short of his 24th birthday. The pilot circled the spot and saw only wreckage on the water. He was 23 years old. Word of his death travelled slowly, the way such news did, first as a line in a squadron diary, then as a telegram, and finally as a paragraph in the same newspapers that had been printing his victories only days before. His mother would receive his Medal of Honor in Boston that summer. His father would learn that the boy who had grown up among Hindu playmates in India, who had watched the Nazis take Vienna and then cross the world to fight them, was gone, lost in the sea off a place called Cape St. George. Why he broke formation for a lighthouse that day, no one can say for certain. Some who knew him thought it was simply who he was, a hunter who could not pass a target, even a small and pointless one, even on the way home. Others wondered whether a man who had lived so long at the very edge of survival had stopped quite believing that anything could touch him. The lighthouse had troubled the fighter group for weeks. Perhaps he only meant to silence a nuisance. Whatever moved him, he was committed to the run before anyone could call him off, and it killed him. He did not live to see the thing he had helped bring about. Barely 2 weeks after his death, the Japanese finally accepted what the sinkhole had done to them. On the 19th and 20th of February, they flew the last of their surviving aircraft out of Rabaul, north to the base at Truk, abandoning the sky over the fortress entirely. There was a bitter irony even in that escape, because American carriers had smashed Truk itself only days before, so the survivors fled toward a ruin. When their mechanics tried to leave Rabaul by ship a day later, Allied bombers sank the vessel beneath them. With that, organized Japanese air resistance over Rabaul simply ended. After that, the raids continued, but they changed in character completely. With no fighters left to rise against them, Allied crews flew over the fortress almost unopposed, and they began to call the missions milk runs, as routine and as safe as a delivery. The most heavily defended position in the South Pacific had become a place a man could fly over in daylight and expect to come home. The transformation was total, and it had taken only a few months. The fortress was now exactly what the decision in Quebec had intended it to be. It was a cage. Its airfields were useless, its harbour was closed to shipping, and its garrison, close to 100,000 men strong, sat sealed off from the war, unable to strike out and not worth the cost of storming. The Allies walked past it. The great base that had anchored Japan's entire southern campaign was beaten without ever being invaded. There was a strategic aftershock to what had happened over Rabaul that reached far beyond the base itself. The veteran carrier pilots Japan had fed into the sinkhole were the same kind of irreplaceable airmen it would desperately need only months later. When the American and Japanese fleets finally clashed only months later in the great carrier battle of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese naval air arm was a hollow shell of half-trained crews, and it was slaughtered so completely that American pilots called it a turkey shoot. Some of the skill that should have defended those carriers had already been burned away in the sky over Rabaul. It would be a distortion to say that one pilot brought down the fortress. He did not. The base was strangled by a whole campaign, by thousands of airmen and sailors, by the engineers who hacked the airfields out of the jungle, by the planners who made the call in Quebec, and by the slow tightening of a ring around the island. But if you wanted a single face for what American air power did over Rabaul in those weeks, you could do worse than the quiet, difficult, deadly young man from Lucknow, who flew into the sinkhole almost every day and, for a while, could not be touched. He had not done it alone, and the squadron around him knew it. The Fighting Corsairs finished their short tour as one of the highest-scoring fighter squadrons in marine history, with a whole handful of aces beside Hansen, men who had flown the same murderous missions and lived to rotate home. When the unit finally pulled off the line, it left behind a record that few squadrons in any air force could match, built in only a few months over the deadliest target in the theatre. By the time it was over, the neutralization of Rabaul had cost Japan something on the order of 600 aircraft, and far worse, hundreds of trained air crew it could never replace. The base that had been the terror of the southern Pacific had been reduced to a garrison of gardeners. All of it had been done by air and sea power reaching out from captured islands, and not one Allied infantryman had been asked to charge the fortified ridges above Simpson Harbour. The victory had not been free for the Allies either. Flying over Rabaul day after day cost airmen their lives, to flak and to fighters, and to the plain treachery of long flights over open sea, in machines that sometimes failed. Robert Hansen was only the most famous of the men who did not come home from those skies. But the exchange was lopsided in the way that decided the campaign, and the difference between the two sides was not only in numbers of aircraft. It was that America could replace its losses and its pilots, and by early 1944, Japan no longer could. There is a human tragedy on the other side of that ledger that is easy to skip past. The men Japan sent up over Rabaul were not cowards or fools. Many were skilled and brave, ordered into a fight their own commanders knew was hopeless, told to defend a base that could not be saved. They climbed into that killing sky above the harbour day after day, under orders they surely knew were close to a death sentence, and most of them did not come back. The sinkholes swallowed them by the hundred, and with them went the last of the trained naval airmen Japan had spent years building. Here is how the campaign unfolded, in order. August 1943, Quebec. Allied leaders decide that Rabaul will be bypassed and neutralized rather than stormed. November 1st, 1943. Marines land at Empress Augusta Bay on Bougainville, bringing Rabaul within fighter range. Robert Hansen is shot down and rescued after 6 hours in a raft. Early January 1944. New airfields on Bougainville open the sustained air campaign against the fortress. January 14th and 24th, 1944. Hansen fights 2 lone battles over Simpson Harbour, downing 5 Zeros and then 4 more, the second earning him the Medal of Honor. February 3rd, 1944. Hansen is killed strafing the lighthouse at Cape St. George, 1 day before his 24th birthday. February 19th to 21st, 1944. The Japanese abandon the sky over Rabaul, and the neutralization of the fortress is complete. The factors that decided the fall of Fortress Rabaul are worth naming, because together they explain how the strongest base in the theatre was beaten without a battle for it. The first factor was the decision itself, made in Quebec, to bypass the fortress rather than storm it. That single choice took the enemy's greatest strength, his prepared and fortified defence, and made it meaningless. There was no assault for the defenders to break. The second factor was geography seized by force. The whole plan depended on taking the islands and building the airfields that brought Allied aircraft within range, above all Bougainville and the strips along the Piva River. Without that captured ground, Rabaul could not have been reached, and the decision would have stayed a line on a map. The third factor was the instrument, the land-based fighter and the men who flew it. The F-4U Corsair and the mixed Allied air command that operated it won and held the sky over the fortress, and it was that air superiority, not any landing, that emptied Rabaul of its power. The fourth factor was attrition, and here the tragedy belonged to the enemy. Japan chose to defend Rabaul to the end, feeding its irreplaceable veteran pilots into a battle they could not win. The sinkholes swallowed the very men Japan could least afford to lose, and their skill died with them and was missed for the rest of the war. Strip away the maps and the casualty counts, and the fall of Fortress Rabaul comes down to a single reversal worth stating plainly. The most powerful base Japan built in the South Pacific was defeated without ever being attacked on the ground. America refused to fight the battle the enemy had spent 2 years preparing, and took the fortress instead by emptying its sky and walking past its walls. And there is a second, smaller reversal folded inside the first. The deadliest pilot of that campaign was a man the Japanese fighters could never bring down in open combat. He was lost instead to the flak of a single lighthouse on a quiet flight home, a day before his birthday. He never lived to see the sky he had done so much to empty finally fall silent, and the man who best embodied the victory did not survive to witness it. What became of them all is its own kind of epilogue. Fortress Rabaul held out uselessly behind the lines for the rest of the war. Its huge garrison was reduced to farming the volcanic soil to feed itself, and the men laid down their arms only in the general surrender of 1945, having barely fired a shot in more than a year. The decision made in Quebec had spared the tens of thousands of American lives that storming those walls would have cost, and the leapfrogging idea it proved would be used to bypass Japanese strongpoints for the rest of the war. For the men sealed inside the base, the war became something stranger than combat. Cut off from supply, they dug deeper into the tunnels they had bored through the volcanic rock, and they turned the slopes around the harbour into gardens, growing their own food to survive. Allied aircraft came and went overhead, and the men below could do nothing but endure and wait. Month after month, they guarded a fortress that no longer mattered to anyone. 100,000 soldiers removed from the war as surely as if they had been captured, without a shot fired to take them. The lesson of Rabaul spread across the rest of the Pacific War. Having shown that the strongest fortress could be strangled rather than stormed, the Allies did it again and again. Truk, the great base to the north, was smashed from the air and then simply left behind. Other island garrisons were bypassed and abandoned to starve. The road that led to the Philippines and finally to Japan was shortened by every fortress the Americans chose not to attack, and that road had been mapped, in large part, in the sky over Simpson Harbor. The timing mattered as much as the method. With Rabaul neutralized and its skies emptied by the early spring of 1944, the two great Allied advances were free to drive on. General MacArthur along New Guinea toward the Philippines and the Navy across the Central Pacific. The base that was meant to block the road to Japan instead sat harmless behind the front, its 100,000 men tending gardens while the war rolled toward Tokyo without them. What had looked 2 years earlier like an impassable wall had been turned into an irrelevance. Robert Hansen was posthumously promoted to captain and awarded the Medal of Honor. It was presented to his mother at a ceremony in Boston in the summer of 1944. His father could not be there because the Reverend Harry Hansen was still in India. serving as the head of a Christian college in the same city where his son had been born. Robert Hansen remains the most successful corsair pilot of the war and one of the youngest Marines ever to receive the nation's highest decoration. His name is carved on the wall of the missing at the Manila American Cemetery, among thousands of others never recovered from the water and the jungle. A Navy destroyer, the USS Hansen, was named in his honor, launched with his mother as its sponsor. That ship had a long life of its own. It served off Korea, where it hunted mine, laying boats and duelled shore batteries, and later off Vietnam, where it shelled targets ashore and ran raids along the coast. It was eventually handed to an Allied Navy in the 1970s and finally sunk as a gunnery target decades after that, an old ship spent at last. For more than half a century, a warship carried the name of the missionary's boy, who had died at 23 in the water off a lighthouse. Other memorials are quieter. Back at the missionary school in the Himalayas, where he had grown up, the sports field still carries his name. And to this day, the Marine Corps gives the Robert M. Hansen Award each year to its finest fighter attack squadron, so that the name of a missionary's son who helped empty the sky over Rabaul is still spoken in the service he died for. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because every week we show you how America actually won the war it is remembered for, not the inflated version that turns a real pilot into a lone Superman against impossible odds. But the true story, where a decision in a conference room and a young man in a cockpit both mattered. Hit subscribe, then like, so this reaches more people who should understand how the mightiest fortress in the Pacific was beaten without a battle. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We will see you in the next one.